Carter Diaz was arrested at 19 in connection with an extortion scheme, released 18 years later due to lack of real evidence. The sentence was read without hesitation in Baton Rouge District Court. The judge, his expression stern and impersonal, barely looked up as he pronounced 20 years in prison. Carter's mother, Regina, slumped in the front pew. Carter remained still, his fists shaking and his eyes fixed on the floor. At 19, he had just been ripped from the life he knew. Outside, on the sidewalk wet with early spring, reporters waited, like vultures, ready to report on the exemplary conviction of a young black man accused of extorting local business owners. A patrol car took Carter straight to the East Feliciana jail. He didn't get a chance to say goodbye. There was no hug from his mother, no words from his younger brother, Malik. The patrol car drove on in silence, as if it were transporting not a human being, but a case file. Years later, the same door at Angola State Penitentiary would open to free him. But the Carter who would emerge was no longer the same. Neither was the world around him, nor was the truth. What happened between those two moments is the story that exposes the devastating cost of a miscarriage of justice. But that was only the beginning of the story that would steal the next 18 years from him. Carter Diaz was born and raised in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, in a lower middle-class neighborhood surrounded by row houses, small backyards, and streetlights that lit up before sunset. At 19, he still shared a room with his brother Malik, played basketball on the Delmont Avenue court, and worked part-time at the Burger Barn on Jefferson Highway. Carter was reserved, quiet, but polite, the kind of kid who said sir even to younger people, the kind of kid who didn't attract attention until he was forced to. His mother, Regina, was a night nurse at General Hospital. She'd worked double shifts since Carter's father disappeared when he was just 8. His 2 children were the center of his life. Carter helped out however he could, paying some of the bills, taking Malik to school, and taking care of the house on his days off. His dream was to pursue a computer technician degree, but there was neither the money nor the time for it. He took it one day at a time, trying to keep everything on track. In the neighborhood, everyone knew Carter as a peaceful young man. Pastor George from the neighborhood church said he had an old man's soul, the kind of person who listens more than he talks, even with few opportunities. Carter was hopeful. He kept to himself, avoided trouble, and made a point of avoiding any involvement with local gangs. But in the American South, being young, black, and poor is enough to make you a target, and Carter would discover this all too soon. On social media, Carter rarely posted photos in his diner uniform, loving messages to his mother, the occasional image of Malik playing soccer. His steps were small but steady. The future didn't seem bright, but it was possible until that week in April 2007, when everything collapsed without warning. The normalcy of his life would be completely destroyed by a series of mistakes that seemed written by someone looking for someone to blame at any cost. The night before his arrest, Carter had dinner with his mother and Malik. They talked about switching cell phone providers, his last school visit, and the rising gas prices. Nothing extraordinary, no omens. The world seemed stable, if limited. At 10:30 p.m., he laid down to sleep. At 8 a.m. the next day, he would be handcuffed in front of dozens of students without explanation. And from that moment on, time would no longer pass the same way. Malik would later say that he never understood how Carter became a suspect. His friends didn't either, nor did his schoolmates. But the police believed they had found a promising link to a phone extortion case, and they needed to act fast. Carter's face fit the narrative. He lived in the right area, was poor enough, and had an unproven juvenile record. He was the ideal target for a case that needed to be concluded quickly, truth or not. The streets, where Carter grew up, once familiar, became threatening. Some neighbors avoided Regina. Malik was beaten at school. People crossed the street to avoid sharing the sidewalk with them. Everything they had built in nearly 2 decades was dismantled. In a week, a name, an accusation, and a social judgment without defense. The legal judgment would come later, but the public condemnation was already solidified. The modest house where Carter lived soon filled with strange voices, public defenders, social workers, investigative police. The kitchen, where they once ate breakfast together, became a deposition room. Regina began sleeping sitting on the couch, waiting for a connection that never came. Malik stopped leaving the house. Chaos descended like an uninvited visitor, and the silence of innocence seemed to scream, but no one wanted to hear. Little by little, Carter began to lose faith in his own reasoning. Did they see something in me that I didn't even notice? He asked his mother. He knew he wasn't guilty, but everyone around him seemed to have decided otherwise. The school didn't comment. His job fired him. Pastor George visited once, then disappeared. In less than 10 days, Carter was already a pariah in his own community. And the most terrifying thing was that he still had no idea what they were really accusing him of. Regina tried to hire a private attorney, but the fees were absurd. He sold his TV and his car, and it still wasn't enough. He accepted a court-appointed public defender, who seemed more concerned with closing the case than investigating. Carter's voice, weak and confused, was frequently interrupted during consultations. The advice was simple: speak as little as possible. But how can you defend yourself when you can't speak? Fear began to creep into Carter's mind like a fog. He slept little, ate even less. He no longer trusted anyone but his mother. He avoided looking in the mirror, as if the reflection were of someone condemned before understanding their own crime. He felt like he was living a bureaucratic nightmare, where everything seemed legal, but nothing was fair. The last Sunday, before the hearing, Regina asked him to wear his favorite shirt, a blue one with a white collar. She said she still believed in justice, that it was all a mistake. Carter didn't respond. He just nodded. As he walked out the door, he glanced at the wall where the photo of his missing father hung. From then on, he would never look at it again. The courtroom was packed. None of his friends showed up, only Regina and Malik. Carter was led away by the armed officers, handcuffed on his wrists and ankles. The metallic clang of the chain seemed to mock his innocence as he sat before the judge. He tried to hold his head high, but deep inside, I already felt like he had no control over anything. He was about to spiral into a spiral that would tear him away from everything he knew. Outside, the world went on as normal. Children headed to school. Buses were packed. People complained about the traffic. Inside the courtroom, a teenager was about to be crushed by the weight of a system never designed to protect people like him. And most cruelly, Carter still didn't know what awaited him at the end of that session. But I still had no idea who was really behind it all. On the morning of April 12, 2007, a Baton Rouge businessman reported to police a series of anonymous calls demanding money in exchange for not revealing compromising information about his personal life. The threats were direct and aggressive. Police quickly traced the origin of the calls to a cell tower covering parts of the Melrose East and Brookstown neighborhoods. The area was predominantly black and poor, and that was enough to guide the investigation. Within 48 hours, a task force compiled the names of young people with prior criminal records, old charges, or simple geographic proximity. Carter Diaz appeared on the list because of a police stop he had suffered the previous year, when he was walking with a group of friends and was mistaken for a drug suspect. Even without evidence or conviction, his name appeared in the database. This, combined with his location near a cell phone tower, made him an immediate target. The following Tuesday, as Carter was leaving the school cafeteria, the armed police officers approached him in the schoolyard. No warrant was presented. The principal was not even notified. Carter was handcuffed in front of his classmates and teachers. He was given no explanation. Malik, who was waiting for him at the gate to go home together, watched in shock. Regina only learned of their arrest almost an hour later, through a cold and formal call from the police station. Carter's arrival at police headquarters was marked by silence and tension. The officer who greeted him was already treating him as if he were guilty. The young man was placed in a windowless room without food or water, under the pretext of waiting for the public defender. But that lawyer would only appear hours later and for only 5 minutes. During that time, Carter was subjected to leading questions, insinuations, and veiled threats. No concrete evidence was presented. There were no screenshots of messages, no call logs directly attributed to Carter, and no witnesses linking him to the calls. Still, the investigators persisted. They claimed they knew everything, that they already had sufficient evidence. The goal was to force him to give in. The tactic was old, but effective, emotionally suffocating the accused until he broke down. And Carter was alone. Regina, desperate, ran to the police station. She waited for almost 2 hours until an assistant greeted her. She asked the reason for the arrest, but received no clear answer. She was told that Carter was a suspect in an ongoing extortion investigation. When she tried to speak to her son, she was prevented. He's being questioned, they said. No one mentioned her rights. No one offered an alternative. Meanwhile, Carter struggled to understand. He denied everything, claiming he didn't know what they were talking about. But the officers alternated between aggression and feigned kindness. One told him that if he confessed, he could be paroled in a few years. The other promised that cooperation was the only way to protect his mother and brother. Little by little, Carter began to doubt himself. Fear was overcoming logic. When he was finally allowed to make a call, Regina answered in tears. He couldn't explain. He could barely speak. He simply said, "Mom, I didn't do anything." And before she could answer, the call was cut off. The public defender, upon arriving, merely confirmed that the case was serious. He suggested Carter remain silent, but he didn't explain what was at stake. There was no defense here, just protocol. The preliminary report stated that Carter may be linked to suspicious calls made between 2 and 4 p.m. on alternating days in March. No one asked where he was on those dates. There was no alibi search, no cell phone location analysis. Everything was based on assumptions. The prosecution's logic was simple. He was there, and that was enough. The truth seemed irrelevant. As night fell, Carter remained trapped in a freezing cell, his stomach empty and his thoughts in disarray. He tried to remember if anyone had used his phone, if he'd lent it to someone, if he lost it for a few minutes. No answer came, because, deep down, he knew he hadn't done anything. But the problem was, for the police, that no longer mattered. The next day, the prosecution requested pretrial detention. They claimed a flight risk and sufficient evidence of involvement. The judge granted it. Carter couldn't defend himself. He couldn't present evidence. The case would go straight to the grand jury in less than 72 hours. His life was completely reconfigured, from student to defendant, from son to statistic, from citizen to prisoner. Local media quickly picked up on the narrative. A young black man, an alleged gang member, linked to a blackmail scheme. Exaggerated headlines featured Carter's face, taken from a school photo. The photo was darkened, enlarged, and distorted. He was already the villain of the story, and the public, fueled by fear and prejudice, accepted the official version without question. The following days were a series of empty hearings, confusing reports and omissions. No one seemed interested in understanding what had actually happened. The important thing was to close the case, demonstrate efficiency, provide answers. Carter became the answer, a wrong answer, but a convenient one, and so the real trial began to take shape long before the court. At home, Regina gathered all her savings. Malik wept in his room. The community, which had previously welcomed them, now shunned them. Threatening letters began arriving. The pressure was suffocating, and without understanding how, Carter began to believe that all of this was beyond his reach. What he didn't know was that this would be just the first of many traps. But no one wanted to hear that it was all a mistake, because the mistake was already working too well. The first mistake came even before the formal charges were filed. Carter was questioned without a lawyer, even though he was under 21 and had no legal knowledge. For nearly 9 hours, he was held in a cold room, without food, with 2 detectives alternating between threats and promises. None of these conversations were recorded in full. Excerpts were later transcribed by hand, and the ones used against him in court seemed tailor-made. No search warrant was issued for his home, but his belongings were searched. Carter's old cell phone, a basic model with no internet connection, was seized as a possible instrument of the crime. Days later, forensic experts determined that the number used for the extortion calls wasn't even registered on the device. Even so, the report wasn't included in the case file. It vanished. It literally disappeared from the prosecutor's file. Regina tried to find explanations. She questioned the investigators. She visited the courthouse. She spoke with public assistants. The answer was always the same: trust the system. But the system didn't trust her. Carter's defense attorney, an overwhelmed lawyer with over 100 ongoing cases, barely remembered his name during hearings. Instead of investigating, I just read reports already tainted with erroneous conclusions. During the trial, the prosecution presented testimony from an anonymous witness, someone who claimed to have heard Carter bragging about the extortion at a party. No date or location was given. When asked to identify the witness, the prosecution claimed protection of integrity. The judge accepted. Carter never even had a chance to learn who was accusing him. Another key error was jury selection. Of the 12 jurors selected, only one was black. The others came from outlying neighborhoods. With little familiarity with Carter's situation, the public defender did not contest the selection. When questioned later, he said he didn't see any advantage in prolonging the case. It was as if Carter had been abandoned before the trial even began. The prosecution also omitted documents. One of them, a geolocation analysis of the cell phone, suggested that Carter was working on the days of the calls. The report was kept confidential until it was reevaluated. It never was. Regina would only discover the existence of this file years later during a parallel investigation. But there, in court, the only version available was the one that interested the prosecution. During the depositions, the detectives involved in the case provided inconsistent information. One of them claimed to have heard Carter confess informally in a moment of unburdening. There was no recording, no witness, but this stray sentence was used by the prosecution as if it were a full confession. In court, every fragment of Carter's silence was interpreted as guilt, every gesture as coldness. When Carter asked to speak during a preliminary hearing, he was interrupted. He was told that any statement outside of his lawyer's handwriting could be prejudicial. But when he tried to guide his own defense attorney with notes, his papers were taken away. Gradually, he was silenced in every possible way. His presence in court was merely symbolic. The verdict seemed to have been determined even before the trial. The prosecutor in charge of the case had been warned before for excessive prosecution. He had pressured witnesses, ignored exculpatory evidence, and exaggerated his claims. But he had never been punished. For the district attorney's office, he was effective. He closed cases quickly. The defendant's actual guilt or innocence was secondary. What mattered was the conviction rate, and Carter was just another line in that statistic. On the day of the sentencing, the judge didn't even revisit the weak points of the case. He simply read the jury's recommendation: 20 years, imprisoned for aggravated extortion. The courtroom fell silent. Regina broke down. Malik screamed, restrained by security. Carter didn't cry. He just closed his eyes. The sound of the judge's gavel ended not only the trial, but a lifetime of possibilities. No one in court mentioned the lack of physical evidence, no proven connection, no recordings, no arrests, just suppositions. Suppositions and a succession of omissions. It was as if the lack of evidence itself had become irrelevant. Carter wasn't guilty because he was proven guilty. He was guilty because it was easier that way, and the system needed guilty people to function. The public defender signed off on the case without appeal. Carter would only learn this months later, already in prison. He asked if he could still appeal. The answer was vague. We can try, but the chances are slim. How could you appeal when you didn't even understand what you were being accused of? The system had its own rhythm, and that rhythm wouldn't stop for anyone, least of all for a kid with no power, money, or influence. In prison, Carter began gathering every possible document, letters, protocols, records. He wanted to prove his innocence. He wrote in the wee hours of the morning, while others slept. But resources were scarce. The library was limited. Internet access was non-existent. Every attempt to understand the case was like navigating a maze with no exit. And yet, he persisted. Regina kept trying. She sent letters, talked to NGOs, knocked on doors that closed. She told herself every day that this couldn't be final, that someone would listen, that someone, somewhere, would care. But the truth was, Carter's case was just one among hundreds, and her story was buried with each passing day, silently. And no one seemed willing to dig up the truth because it was more disturbing than comforting. During the initial interrogation, Carter was left alone for more than 3 hours. The light in the room was cold, vibrating on the ceiling, and the air conditioning kept the temperature at uncomfortable levels. When the detectives returned, they changed their tone. They went from aggressive to persuasive. They claimed they had footage, witnesses, and connections traced. None of it was true, but it sounded plausible to someone confused, afraid, and lacking proper legal guidance. They promised that if he simply admitted involvement, he could get just a few years and might not even go to maximum security. They used his mother and brother as emotional leverage. They suggested Malik could be charged as an accomplice, that Regina would lose her home and her job if Carter didn't come clean soon. The manipulation was surgical and brutal. Carter insisted he hadn't done anything. that he didn't know what they were talking about. But the detectives kept asking the same questions, repeating the accusations as truths. They showed him papers with dates, names, and numbers. Nothing made sense, but everything seemed dangerous. He was tired, having not eaten in over 12 hours. When he asked for a lawyer, he was told that it would delay everything and make things even worse. At the end of the third day, Carter signed a document he didn't write, a printed text full of legalese, stating that he acknowledged having participated in conversations related to the extortion plot, albeit indirectly. He would later admit that he didn't understand what he was signing. He just wanted it all to be over. He just wanted to go home. He didn't realize he was digging his own grave. The cell phone technical report, which proved that Carter's device had no call history to the extortionist numbers, was sent to the prosecutor's office and ignored. The police department claimed it did not alter the already established narrative. The prosecutor's office attached another report based on tower triangulation, which suggested that Carter may have made calls because he was in the area. It was vague, but sufficient for the prosecution in court. This forced confession was used as central evidence. It was repeated exhaustively by the prosecutor, with emphasis on isolated passages. The defense attorney did not question the document's validity. He did not request expert testimony on the moment of the interrogation. He did not demand recordings. He simply accepted that the young man had confessed. When Carter attempted to explain the context of the signature, he was warned to remain silent. Other inconsistencies emerged. A witness claimed to have seen Carter on a street corner making suspicious calls, but the date she gave coincided with Carter's work schedule at Burger Barn. The company, however, didn't keep electronic records, and the manager, under pressure, claimed, "I don't remember exactly." Even so, the testimony was upheld and used to bolster the prosecution's case. One of the extortion victims recognized Carter in a photo during the investigation, but in court, he said he wasn't sure. The prosecutor insisted that trauma can affect visual memory. The defense didn't question the photo identification, which had been made using an image of Carter, already handcuffed, an illegal but recurring practice. The truth, once again, was shaped to the conviction's liking. The prosecution further alleged that Carter had connections with local gang members. Without providing names, dates, or actual ties, the mention was enough. The jury reacted with stern looks. In the popular imagination, this information carried more weight than any technical data. It was the perfect narrative. Young, black, from the suburbs, connected to crime. It was convenient and dangerous. Meanwhile, Carter could barely sleep in the cell where he awaited trial. Food was scarce, and insults from the guards were a daily occurrence. Some said he would never get out of there. Others laughed at the case. He felt like he was being pushed along by an uncontrollable tide. At worst of all, everything seemed to be happening legally. No obvious irregularities, just a cruel pileup of neglect and distortions. Regina visited her son weekly. She brought books, prayers, promises. She tried to offer strength. But little by little, she saw her son's gaze fade. Malik didn't want to go anymore. She said she hated seeing her brother behind glass, like a zoo animal. The silence between them grew, and Carter began to convince himself that perhaps no one would ever take him away. Pastor George, who had previously said that God acts justly, avoided talking about the case. He told Regina it was best to wait for the dust to settle. Neighbors stopped greeting her. Carter stopped being a young man in the community. He became a problem, a burden, a name that could no longer be mentioned without discomfort. He was erased from the collective memory while he was still alive. Each night, Carter replayed the interrogation in his head. He tried to remember where he'd gone wrong, when he'd given in, if there were any details he could use. But the confession had already been signed, and with it, the accusation had become unquestionable. The paper, printed and stamped, was worth more than his word, and there, his word was no longer worth anything. The system didn't need to prove its guilt. It just needed to appear legitimate, and to do that, it simply suffocated until silence became a sentence. During the trial, the prosecution called 3 witnesses to support the case. The first, a neighborhood friend of Carter's, claimed to have seen him talking on the phone in a suspicious tone on a street corner near a convenience store, but when pressed, he couldn't pinpoint the date or recall what Carter was saying. Even so, his testimony was upheld as compatible evidence. The judge didn't question it. The defense attorney didn't forcefully counter it. The second witness was one of the victims of the alleged extortion scheme. She stated that she believed she heard Carter's voice on one of the connections. However, he admitted never having seen him in person before the trial. Upon replaying the audio of the threat, which wasn't even authenticated, he hesitated. He said, "Maybe you confused me." Even so, the prosecution insisted that the victim's doubt confirmed Carter's presence in the operations. The third witness was a police officer. He claimed to have received anonymous information about Carter being involved with a group that carried out phone scams, but he never identified the informant. He said that the environment indicated involvement. He based his argument on subjective observations, clothing, times Carter was out, friends with police records, no direct connections, no physical evidence, only deductions. When Regina took the witness stand, her voice faltered. She said her son was home most of the days indicated in the investigation, that she worked almost every afternoon shift, that she helped her brother with his schoolwork. The prosecutor interrupted her several times. He tried to paint her statement as a maternal, emotional, and biased narrative. The jury seemed to back away. She left the courtroom crying, unable to finish. Two of Carter's friends, who attempted to testify on his behalf, were discredited by minor date errors. They claimed he was with them on the afternoon one of the calls was made, but because they couldn't remember the exact day, the defense couldn't include their testimony as direct evidence. The judge called it testimony without chronological basis. In effect, he completely ignored it. The prosecutor constantly emphasized, "We don't need all the pieces, just look at the whole." The whole, however, was fragile, inconsistent, and riddled with gaps, but it was constructed with conviction. The strategy was simple: repeat the narrative so many times that it sounded coherent through exhaustion. The lack of logic was masked by an excess of words. Carter watched everything in silence. He wanted to stand up and tell them they were lying, but every time he spoke to the defense, he was told not to provoke the jury. The defense limited itself to general questions. Without confronting the key points, Carter felt as if he were being judged in a play where the roles were already assigned, and his was the villain. At one point, the prosecutor mentioned a hallway story from an inmate at the local jail. This man, whose name was never revealed, reportedly said that Carter talked too much about the scam. There was no recording, document, or formal testimony. Even so, the judge allowed the mention as context of conduct, and once again, the accusation gained weight without substance. During the trial, no one presented phone records with Carter's number linked to the businessmen. The calls were made from prepaid phones with no traceable origin. Still, the prosecution claimed he could have used disposable devices purchased with cash. No purchase was proven. No camera footage showed him buying a cell phone, but the idea seemed plausible enough for the jury to accept. The prosecution's notes mentioned a possible connection between Carter and another suspect, but that name was never formally presented. The judge accepted that the investigation was ongoing and kept the identity of the alleged partner confidential. This prevented the defense from conducting any independent investigation. The case became increasingly uneven. Regina hired a private investigator on her own, selling some of the house's furniture. He found a witness who completely contradicted the police officer accusing Carter. This witness, however, was rejected by the court as irrelevant to the current course of the case. The truth was considered inconvenient and therefore dismissed before being heard. One of the jurors reportedly said in the hallway that he thought the kid was strange. With that blank look in his eyes, he was reprimanded but remained in the jury. The defense didn't speak. Carter heard this from a security guard and couldn't face the jury the same way anymore. He felt judged by his expression, his skin color, his accent, never by logic or justice. At the final hearing, when the defense requested an extra week to gather counter evidence, the request was denied. The prosecutor stated that the evidence had been clear for months. The judge agreed, and the trial ended without the right to a proper defense. It was as if time had been sped up to quickly close a chapter that was more disturbing than it deserved. Attention. Carter broke down in the visiting room with his mother. He said, "They don't care if it was me. They just want someone to blame." Regina tried to respond, but couldn't find the words. She just held his hand through the glass. Time seemed to slip from her eyes, and the conviction of her son's innocence was no longer enough to keep him on the other side of the fence. The versions, dates, testimonies, and evidence all combined. With one certainty, There was more doubt than truth, but the court didn't want doubt. It wanted a solution. And to achieve that, it didn't matter how much the accounts contradicted each other as long as they served the narrative. Because in a system where haste trumps precision, doubt isn't an obstacle, it's fuel. During his first months in Angola penitentiary, Carter collapsed. He lost 30 pounds. He spoke little. He ate even less. He spent hours staring at the floor of his cell, as if trying to claw his way out. At night, the screams of other inmates echoed through the corridors. During the day, the silence was broken by the guard's curt orders. Time seemed to dilate, freeze, mock him. Regina wrote every week, letters filled with forced hope, attempts at consolation, promises of struggle, but Carter took days to respond. When he did, they were short lines, loose sentences. I'm here. I still can't believe it. I don't want to wake up anymore. Malik read the letters in secret. He felt guilty about being free. He began skipping school. Then he dropped out. Carter's room remained untouched at home. Regina wouldn't let anyone touch it. His clothes were folded, his sneakers beside the bed, his notebook still on the desk. Sometimes she'd come into the room and cry silently for hours. Other times, I'd sleep there, hugging the shirt he'd been wearing the day of his arrest. It was the only set left. Malik began to isolate himself. He spent hours playing video games or wandering the streets aimlessly. He blamed himself for not having defended his brother. He blamed his mother for believing in the system. He stopped going to church. He refused visitors. The family's grief was silent, but intense. A disembodied grief, a living loss, a son ripped away without warning. Carter tried to keep his mind occupied by reading. He borrowed books from the prison's small library. He said it was his way of keeping from going completely insane. He read about justice, philosophy, and American history. He tried to understand how a country that spoke so much of freedom could be so efficient in imprisoning innocent people. Reading was a refuge, but sometimes it was also torture. The therapy sessions offered by the prison were short, shallow, and bureaucratic. Carter felt more exposed than welcomed when he mentioned his innocence. The therapist simply wrote it down. No reaction, no belief. It was like talking to a wall. Gradually, he stopped going. He learned to hide his pain, to swallow his despair, to keep quiet. Regina's letters began to lose their optimistic tone. They began to describe the difficulties of life abroad, the overdue bills, the lost job, the loneliness. She said she was still fighting, but exhaustion seeped through between the lines. She once wrote, "I don't know how much longer I can hold on." Carter replied, "Don't give up before I do." But deep down, he himself no longer believed it. Christmas. That first year was spent in silence. Regina made the same dinner as always: rice, roast chicken, sweet potatoes, and placed Carter's plate on the table, untouched. Malik didn't show up. He said he was with friends. Regina ate alone. Then she put the food away and cried herself to sleep on the couch. It was the dinner of absence. The prison routine made everything mechanical. Breakfast at 5, inspection at 6, work at 7. Carter was assigned to the laundry. He washed the uniforms of other inmates, including some who mocked him. They said he looked like he actually made them. He didn't respond. He just scrubbed, folded, and hung. His hands were constantly sore. When Malik first visited Carter, he didn't say a word the entire time. He just stared at him, as if searching for his former brother behind his dull eyes. Carter tried to smile, but failed. Finally, Malik stood up and whispered, "I'm sorry." He left without waiting for a response. It was the last time he saw him for the next 2 years. Regina began to develop blood pressure problems. She had to be hospitalized twice. The doctor recommended that she stop working night shifts, but she had no choice. She needed to pay the bills. She started selling homemade cakes, used clothes, whatever. She told a neighbor, "If I stop, my son will die in there on Sundays." Carter sat in his cell listening to the services broadcast over loudspeakers. Sometimes he prayed. Other times, he just listened. He wasn't sure he believed in God anymore, but he liked to pretend those words spoke to him. It was the only voice that still seemed to come from outside the concrete. On Regina's rare visits, she tried to show strength. She brought news of the neighborhood, old photos, fond memories. But Carter just listened in silence. Sometimes he cried after she left. Other times, he stared at the empty chair. It was a void that wouldn't go away, a time that wouldn't return. a name that had stopped being called. During his second year in prison, Carter attempted suicide. He cut his arm with a hidden razor blade. He was taken to the infirmary and spent 3 days under observation. No one told Regina. When she found out, she broke down. She told the warden, "He was my boy, but no one responded. They just took her back to the front gate." The collapse wasn't a moment. It was a process. A slow erosion of hope, identity, and the will to carry on. Justice didn't just imprison Carter. It undid every bond, every certainty, every gesture of humanity. What remained was a functioning body and a comatose soul. And the cruelest thing was knowing that the world went on, as if it had never existed. Shortly after Carter's arrest, the local press in Baton Rouge was quick to spin a popular story. 19-year-old linked to sophisticated extortion scheme. Read the headline. Louisiana Crime Weekly. Carter's photo, taken at the police station in poor lighting, was on the front page. He looked cold, hardened, but it was just fear. The image, however, said it all to anyone who wanted to judge without knowing. The article cited sources close to the investigation, claiming that Carter belonged to a group that had been operating since 2005. None of this information was proven, but that didn't matter. The case was gaining attention, and the public consumed every bit of that version as absolute truth. Carter's name quickly became synonymous with danger on local forums and social media. Radio news reports commented dismissively on lost youth and the audacity of the new urban criminals. None of them contacted the family. No journalist went to Regina's home to hear the other side. No report mentioned the lack of physical evidence. It was easier to paint a culprit than to investigate a complex story. The truth didn't get ratings. Guilt did. Local TV interviewed a shopkeeper who said he was relieved by the rest. "We're safer now," he said, with the store in the background. He had never seen Carter, but he spoke with conviction. It was this kind of testimony that set the scene. The narrative of an invisible, yet conveniently personified, villain. A face, a name, a fixed target. Radio stations, which reached the most peripheral neighborhoods, broadcast inflammatory comments. Another delinquent off the streets, one host said. Will they ever learn? These speeches reinforced the idea that Carter represented something larger. He wasn't an individual. He was a symbol of everything that was wrong with the city's youth. And for that, he deserved to be severely punished. Regina even wrote letters to newspapers. He asked for space to tell his son's version. No one responded. She even called radio shows, but her voice was cut off, ignored, or dismissed as a mother in denial. Public opinion had already been formed, and it was shaped by fear, prejudice, and laziness. Some of Carter's friends deleted photos of him from social media. His school didn't issue any notice. The Burger Barn manager said he would not comment on legal matters. The silence grew like a shadow. Carter was suddenly a name no one wanted to remember, an uncomfortable past everyone preferred to forget. Even inside the prison, Carter heard echoes of it all. Other inmates commented on him. Some said they'd seen you in the paper. Others mocked. You seem smarter than that. Even the guards joined in. One even held up a printed article and asked, "Do you like your fame?" Carter didn't answer. He just lowered his head. The weight was unbearable. Malik, meanwhile, began to be teased on the street. Your brother's a criminal, right? Some schoolmates avoided him. Others talked behind his back. He began fighting more, distancing himself from teachers. Carter's reputation followed him like a poisonous cloud, and the sky over his family only darkened with each passing day. Regina began to avoid leaving the house. She went to the grocery store at off hours. She stopped going to church. She felt the stares. Conversations interrupted whenever she entered a room. It was as if the town had decided she was also guilty of giving birth to someone like Carter. Public judgment knew no boundaries or filters. Pastor George, who had previously used Carter's name in examples of overcoming, began to avoid him in his sermons. He once said, without naming names, even those who seem good can hide evil. Regina never returned to that mass. She knew the message was for her. She knew that, even without proof, they had condemned her son and now they were condemning her, too. When a small civil rights NGO tried to visit Carter, they were barred. They claimed a security risk. His case was too sensitive to be reopened under outside pressure. The media ignored this attempt. No one reported it. Silence was complicit. And when silence is bought for convenience, it becomes a weapon. Carter began to question whether she would ever have a chance to be heard. If only a newspaper would print the truth, she wrote in a letter to her mother. But the truth didn't make headlines. Miscarriages of justice didn't sell newspapers. The image of a wrongly convicted boy didn't cause outrage. It caused discomfort, and no one wanted to feel responsible. Carter's imprisonment wasn't just legal. It was social, moral, and symbolic. The world outside had also locked him away. The headlines continued. The programs changed topics. The commentators searched for another defendant of the week. But his life had been sealed with newspaper ink and microphones turned off. And when the truth is drowned out by headlines, the error becomes official history, and those who pay for it have no right to edit it. In 2023, an investigative journalist named Olivia Bram from the small publication Lucianane Watchdog came across Carter Diaz's name in an old report on controversial cases with weak evidentiary basis. At first, it was just another name on a long list, but something about the coldness of the proceedings caught her attention. The lack of material evidence, the speed of the trial, the confession with the press signature, everything reeked of error, and Olivia wasn't blind to that kind of smell. She decided to reread the trial documents. She found deleted passages, ignored evidence, and most importantly, a lack of counter-evidence from the defense. In a fair system, that would never have been enough for a conviction. Olivia marked each inconsistency with a red pen, as she had done since college. By the end of the reading, she had a notebook full of questions and a firm decision. She would see it through to the end. The first person he approached was Regina. He knocked on the door of the small house on Dalemo Drive with his notebook in hand and a direct look in his eyes. Regina hesitated. She was tired of promises, journalists, NGOs, curious people. But there was something in Olivia's manner that convinced her to open the door. They sat in the kitchen, surrounded by old photos and the smell of brewed coffee, and there, after so many years, Regina told her everything again without crying. But with a broken voice, Olivia also wanted to hear from Carter. She requested a visit to Angola. She was denied twice. The third time, she was granted it. She walked through the prison gates with firm steps and a hidden recorder. When she entered the visiting room, Carter was already waiting for her with downcast eyes and a suspicious expression. She introduced herself and explained her purpose. He listened in silence. Only at the end did she murmur, "If you're like the others, you won't have to come back." But Olivia returned. Once, twice, 3 times, each time with new questions, details, and paperwork. Carter no longer remembered signing. She began to piece together the timeline. She compared reports, accessed forgotten files in public forums, located witnesses who had been disregarded. With each new piece, the puzzle revealed what Carter had been saying all along. He was innocent. One of Olivia's biggest discoveries came when she compared the times of the extortion calls with timesheets at the diner where Carter worked. Months later, she obtained a delivery log from a local supplier that showed Carter signing for goods at the exact time of one of the calls attributed to him. It was the first solid external evidence, and it had gone unnoticed for 18 years. She also found a key witness who had been ignored, a former co-worker of Carter's, who claimed to have been with him during the other incidents involving the calls. This man, now living in Houston, claimed the defense had never contacted him. Olivia recorded the interview. When she showed it to Carter, he couldn't hold back the tears. That voice, coming from outside, made him feel like time could still pass. Olivia compiled the new evidence into a 42-page dossier and filed it with the State Public Defender's Office. But, as expected, the request was dismissed without review. The reason, matter already final and binding. The old walls of justice were still standing, but Olivia wasn't one to give up. If the state wouldn't listen, she would take the case to the public. He published a series of reports on his website. He used accessible language, strong photographs, and shocking procedural details. The stories went viral. Major newspapers began to replicate the data. Hashtags with Carter's name circulated on social media. People began to ask, how did this happen? The wall trembled, and now everyone saw it. With the noise growing, the Louisiana Innocence Project entered the case. Experienced lawyers, specialized in overturning wrongful convictions, took the lead. Carter now had a real team. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, there were people on his side, professionals who listened, who questioned, who sought justice, not closure. The defense team filed a new request for a review of the sentence, based on documentary and testimonial evidence, and the lack of an effective defense in the original trial. The prosecution resisted. It tried to argue that the new evidence did not substantially change the facts of the case, but now people were watching, reporters, legal experts, the public. Olivia continued to follow every step. She wrote weekly updates and went on live streams explaining behind-the-scenes events. Her figure had become a symbol of resistance against a system that fails and fails selectively. She received threats and was discredited by conservative commentators, but she didn't back down. With each attack, she responded with more documents, more truths. Carter began writing again. He sent letters to Olivia with notes, memories, ideas. His mind was moving again. He no longer dreamed of freedom. He dreamed of explanations, of the right to understand how a country that claims to be just could err so much, and then remain silent, and more than that, how it could still refuse to correct itself. Olivia Bram's entry into the story wasn't just the arrival of a reporter. It was the introduction of doubt into a place where there had been only silence. And when doubt enters, error can no longer hide, because the truth can be ignored for a while, but it doesn't disappear forever. With the dossier in hand, the Team Louisiana Innocence Project filed the first motion to reopen Carter's case in January 2024. The document cited inconsistencies in the original filing, ignored evidence, neglected testimony, and the absence of an adequate defense. But the court's response was curt, appeal dismissed for lack of significant new facts. It was as if nothing had been presented, as if 18 years of error didn't even merit a second look. The lawyers persisted. They filed a new lawsuit based on constitutional flaws, the right to a full defense, and the use of coercively obtained evidence. But the original prosecutor, still in office, argued that the conviction represented the will of the jury and that reopening the case would set dangerous precedents for the system. It was bureaucracy serving as a shield against the truth, and the system, once again, protected itself. A state judge, reviewing the new request, questioned why Carter took so long to present the evidence. The defense responded firmly, because the system never gave him access. Even so, the case was shelved once again. The justification, legal stability, as if stability were more important than innocence, as if time would erase the error rather than amplify it. Meanwhile, Olivia continued documenting everything, the denials, the weak arguments, the back and forth between prosecutors and judges. In one of her reports, she wrote, if Carter Diaz were white, rich, and from an upscale neighborhood, this case would have already been resolved with a national apology. The story went viral. But still, the doors remained closed. The group of lawyers took the case to federal court, alleging civil rights violations. They presented not only the errors in the trial, but also the devastating impact on Carter and his family's lives. They requested an emergency hearing. The federal judge, however, set the hearing for 6 months later. Time, already a cruel obstacle, now became a formal obstacle. During this period, the prison system tried to discourage any outside action. Carter was transferred to another wing, lost access to some books, and had visits canceled without warning. The justification was security measures, but he knew it was punishment in disguise. It was the system trying to smother any spark of hope before it caught fire. Despite this, Carter resisted. He wrote every day. He sent letters to Olivia, to his lawyers, to NGOs. His words were clear, firm now. He didn't want revenge. He wanted answers. He wanted to know why no one had listened before, why everyone had given up on him so quickly, why justice seemed afraid of its own shadow. The legal team filed a parallel petition requesting a review of the conviction, based on a new technical report, now validated by independent experts. The document demonstrated that the phone records used by the prosecution in the trial did not even belong to devices associated with Carter. It was technical evidence, cold, impartial, irrefutable, but even this faced obstacles. The prosecutor's office responded in a public statement that it continued to believe in the integrity of the original case and that any new analysis should be conducted with caution. No word on the new evidence, no comment on the confession obtained under duress. Just institutional silence disguised as legal caution. Olivia organized a public rally in front of the state courthouse. Mothers of other wronged inmates attended. Signs with slogans like "Justice for Carter" and "Evidence doesn't disappear." Its ignored stood tall under the Baton Rouge sun. Local TV, which had once painted Carter as a criminal, now called him an example of a possible miscarriage of justice, but it was still not enough. It was still slow. The former public defender who had worked on Carter's case in 2007 was located and interviewed. He said on camera that he regretted not having done more, but that the system was too fast for those without power. This statement caused a stir. Carter watched the prison video. For the first time, he heard an apology, albeit a belated, incomplete one. Even with growing public support, the judiciary remained hesitant. Some said behind the scenes that reopening Carter's case could trigger a chain reaction, that other trials would surface, that many stones would have to be turned over. It was as if the fear of righting the wrong outweighed the wrong itself, as if the truth were a risk, not a remedy. The lawyers began preparing a petition to the state Supreme Court, a last resort before the final dismissal. They knew the chances were slim, but they also knew Carter couldn't wait another 10 years. He'd already lost his youth. He'd already lost his father, his faith, his friends. They couldn't let him lose the rest of his time as well. At that time, Carter wrote the phrase that would be splashed across newspapers for months: if justice must be slow to be just, then why was it so quick to destroy me? This question echoed across social media, universities, and human rights groups. Public opinion was beginning to demand what the system refused to admit. The system resisted, but the pressure increased, and every institutional silence became a cry of omission, because sometimes the truth only comes out when the shame becomes too unbearable to keep hidden. It was on a sultry afternoon in June 2024 that the unexpected turn of events occurred. One of the lawyers for Louisiana Innocence Project, while reviewing old prosecutorial files, found a forgotten document among digitized folders of cold cases. It was an unused statement signed by a man named Ylen Foster, dated 2007, in which he claimed to have been coerced into mentioning Carter's name in exchange for a reduced sentence. No one had mentioned that name before. The document was marked non-essential, but now it was vital. Ylen Foster had been arrested 2 months before Carter for petty theft. According to the affidavit, the detective offered him a deal. All he had to do was mention Carter Diaz as involved in suspicious conversations, and he could get less time. Ylen, 18 at the time, accepted. He was scared. He had a newborn daughter. He signed without reading it properly, but he was never called to testify. The deal was sealed behind the scenes, and Carter's name became part of the indictment. Locating Ylen was difficult. He was now living in Texas, driving delivery trucks on night shifts. When Olivia's team approached him, he was shocked. "I thought they'd already taken care of this. I thought he was guilty." Upon learning that Carter was still in custody, the reaction was immediate. Ylen agreed to record a new statement. He admitted lying. He said he was manipulated, and he apologized on camera, his voice breaking. This new testimony, accompanied by official documents from the time and Ylen's original signature, was filed in federal court in less than 24 hours. The legal team knew it was the missing piece, a direct link to the origin of the accusation, an admission that the truth had been fabricated, a brick removed from the wall with the potential to bring everything down. At the same time, a new digital expert hired by the defense presented an updated report based on current technologies. Using more accurate triangulation software, he proved that the extortion calls could not have originated from any area where Carter was on those dates. Carter's phone not only failed to make the calls, it didn't even have a signal at the time. Technical error? No. Willful omission. The two documents were presented together, the false confession and the technical report. It was the first time in 18 years that the truth had a face, form, date, and indisputable legal weight. Upon receiving the material, the federal judge temporarily suspended the conviction and scheduled an urgent hearing to reevaluate the sentence. The silence in the courtroom was thick. Everyone knew something was about to change. Carter was briefed by one of the lawyers in the prison yard. He didn't react with elation. He simply took a deep breath, sat on the bench, and stared at the ground for a few minutes. Then he said, "Maybe now they'll listen." There was no victory in his tone. There was exhaustion, there was pain, but there was also something not seen on his face for years: restrained hope. Olivia immediately published the discovery in her column. The report spread like wildfire. National newspapers replicated it. TV shows commented on the case. Hashtags calling for Carter's release dominated social media. Public figures spoke out, and, for the first time, the Louisiana justice system was placed under an uncomfortable spotlight. The prosecutor's office issued a defensive statement, saying that the new allegations would be seriously examined. But it was too late. The pressure was public, institutional, emotional, and, above all, it was moral. The country was now watching, and the system, cornered, began to give in. On the day of the hearing, the courtroom was packed. Carter, handcuffed, was led into the room surrounded by journalists, activists, and onlookers. Regina was in the front row. Malik, now 26, was also there. When the judge entered, everyone stood. The atmosphere was tense. The documents were read aloud, and the judge's expression changed with each new piece of evidence presented. The defense attorney concluded his statement by saying, "We're not asking for a favor. We're demanding a correction." The judge called a 30-minute recess. When he returned, his decision was clear: immediate annulment of the sentence. Carter was to be released while the case was formally reviewed. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Regina burst into tears. Malik covered his face with his hands. Carter simply closed his eyes. On the way back to prison for his formal release, Carter said nothing. He sat on the van seat with his fists bound and stared out the fogged-up window. He couldn't believe it. He couldn't allow himself to believe it. They had already taken everything from him once. Freedom, now, seemed too fragile to be taken for granted. But the bars were about to open. The missing key had finally been found, and time, which had crushed him for nearly 2 decades, was slowly beginning to work in his favor. Because sometimes, justice only moves when the truth bleeds before the eyes of those who can no longer pretend they didn't see it. It was 7:42 a.m. when Carter Diaz was taken to the release room at Angola State Penitentiary. His orange uniform, worn with age, weighed heavily on his shoulders like a memory he'd rather forget. Around him, officers watched him silently. Some had known him since his early days. None of them said a word. The sound of the clock high on the wall seemed louder than anything else. Tick, tock. Time was about to change. Outside, a crowd was gathering: journalists, camera crews, activists, onlookers. Olivia Brand was there, clutching the battered notebook she'd started this journey with. Regina and Malik hugged each other as if trying to contain their anxiety. The mother was dressed in blue, as she had been on the first day of the trial. "So, he can see me from afar," she said. The prison gates, surrounded by rusty bars and impatient gazes, would finally be passed through by someone who should never have entered. When Carter emerged, escorted by 2 guards, time seemed to stand still. He walked slowly, his eyes squinting against the sunlight he hadn't felt directly in years. His expression was unreadable. He didn't smile. He didn't cry. He just breathed. Each step felt heavy, as if his feet were buried in the past. But he walked toward life. Regina ran to him. The security guards hesitated, then backed away. Mother and son embraced in the middle of the concrete road that separated their worlds. A hug that lasted longer than the news reports would allow. Carter said nothing. He just closed his eyes and felt his mother's arms around him as if he could, for a moment, return to his former self. Malik waited nearby. Then he pulled him into a second hug. "You're here, bro. You're here." The cameras captured everything, but they couldn't capture what was inside Carter. Years of anguish, of lost time, of swallowed words. When a reporter asked how he felt, he simply replied, "I'm still trying to understand what happened to me." And he turned his face away. There was no rehearsed speech. There was no loud anger. There was rubble inside. The legal team was closely monitoring him. They had already initiated proceedings for civil compensation, but they knew that no amount of money would ever restore what Carter had lost. His youth, his opportunities, his simple days, his ordinary mornings, his sense of belonging. No check could cover it. Only time, and time never gave back. Olivia walked behind, watching. When she approached Carter, he simply said, "You heard me." She nodded, her eyes welling up. They didn't need to say anything else. The journalist, who started out as a name on a spreadsheet, was now a living part of a story the system had tried to bury, and she had managed to bring it to light with precision, with courage. Inside the Baton Rouge courtroom, a new judge read the final judgment of dismissal. The case would be dismissed as a serious legal error with significant procedural flaws. No direct mention of the prosecutors' names. No formal admission of guilt by the state. Just a filed document. But for Carter, it was a certificate of existence. A belated acknowledgement that his word deserved to be heard. Outside the courthouse, an impromptu press conference was held. His lawyers spoke on his behalf. They said Carter needed time, silence, and rebuilding. He wasn't ready for interviews, nor microphones. He was learning to breathe again, to sleep, without waking up startled, to enter a room, without looking up for cameras. Returning home, Carter sat on the couch where his mother had cried for years. The same couch where she had fallen asleep, waiting for answers that never came. The house was the same, but everything was different. He walked to his old room. There were still posters on the wall. The sneakers he had left behind at 19 were still beside the bed. He picked them up and broke down. That night, Carter slept in his own bed. For the first time in 18 years, he woke without locks, without bars, without metallic clanging. The noise that woke him was the wind hitting the window, a simple sound, a sound that moved him. He lay there, staring at the ceiling. The world was strange, but at least now, he could look at it. The press kept reporting it. The Diaz case became an example of systemic failure. Universities debated it. NGOs cited it. His name was a symbol. But Carter didn't want to be a symbol. He wanted to be a man, a son, a brother, a citizen. He wanted to walk down the street without feeling like everyone was watching him. He wanted to learn how to use a smartphone, how to order food through an app, how to catch a bus without panicking. The day after his release, Carter went to his childhood playground. He sat on the same bench where he chatted with Malik. The late afternoon sun was weak. He closed his eyes for a few seconds. He didn't think about justice or revenge. He just thought about being alive and how, even free, it would still take time to understand what freedom meant. The system had let him go, but it had left invisible scars, wounds that no longer bled but that would never completely heal, because sometimes being released isn't the end of a sentence, it's the beginning of what's left of it. Carter Diaz returned home with his body free, but his soul marked by invisible scars. No ceremony can restore lost time. No sentence can undo institutional abandonment, the collapse of trust, the public shame, the private pain. He survived but was ripped from himself by a system that preferred to appear efficient rather than fair. For 18 years, Carter lived like a ghost, invisible to those who could help him, all divisible to those who wanted to blame him. Justice failed him at every step, from his arrest without evidence, to his rigged trial, to his neglect of appeals. And when they finally acknowledged their error, they did so without remorse, without full reparation, without holding anyone accountable. Carter's story is one among thousands, a name that gained prominence because it was heard at the right time. But how many others remain forgotten in dimly lit cells? How many Carters still sign confessions they never said, unaware they are condemning their own youth? How many Reginas still write letters hoping for answers that never come? The truth came out, but the price was too high, and it continues to be. Because until those responsible for miscarriages of justice are held accountable, the system will continue to function exactly as it was designed, to protect some and punish others without balance, without equity, without humanity. Today, Carter walks free, but the burning question isn't about him. It's about us. What happens when justice errs and no one pays? What happens when time becomes a weapon against the innocent? What happens when silence is more important than the truth? How many more lives will justice miss before something changes?